what you're interested in hearing about. And otherwise, now that I've introduced the panel, I'd like to just get started. So hopefully all of you are ready. And we will begin with the first question, which I think I'd like to start directing to Jim as a initial informer of the information. So Jim, relevant to your industry, how do cybersecurity issues affect a wide variety of audiences that you see, maybe from business to the consumer, and the differences in effect between small and large businesses?
Well, thanks, Sherry, and Emily. Thanks again for putting this together. This is, for us, it's been a lot of fun, and maybe we'll even learn something tonight, right? I think that's what we're all here for. It's actually quite interesting because I've been in this business for a period of time where, many of the issues in cybersecurity started off affecting, mostly financial institutions as well as telecom companies. And it was very, very typically enterprise oriented. And many of these items in these problem areas were really blind to the consumer. And then over the past 30 plus years, it's evolved at a level where, these issues now really affect everything that we do, whether it's online transactions, whether it's banking, whether it's pharmaceuticals, whether it's people just doing simple activities like going to Amazon.com or Walmart.com and ordering items. But the problems have gotten quite significant compared to where it was initially. The initial problems we had were often just, a hacker, as they were called, or a young intruder, as they were portrayed, right? Some teenager who was trying to just show you that he could break into his network, or some network that, he was trying to prove his abilities or her abilities. And now it's getting to the point where there are some pretty bad actors out there, and those bad actors are trying to impact, everything in life, whether it's your financial transactions, the infrastructure around you that protects you, whether it's DoD or intelligence community related items. And that's a challenge, not just for large enterprises, it's a challenge for small businesses, which frankly, from a small business perspective, many of these organizations have just been overrun because of the types of threats and security issues that they now have to deal with. And of course, like everything, as we all know, and we see in our businesses, staffing is minimized, fewer people to do more work, right? So where do you put your priorities? And from a consumer perspective, it becomes daunting, because if you're not somewhat literate in this area, right, you can really be exposed and really be taken for either your personal information, your private data, or potentially have financial impact.
Thank you. Mark, do you want to follow up with that?
Sure. Thanks, Sherry and Jim. Mark Fear, 93 and 99. And a tie-in with the school is I was working for Raytheon at the time, and they had a tuition reimbursement program, and that's how I got through the bachelor's degree. And graduating with the bachelor's degree, I went from the factory floors at Raytheon to their engineering center, and I got involved with Unix system administration. And I did that for about 10 or 15 years. And now I'm in auditing, which where it's implied that it works, is it working securely? And I'm sure, Sherry, I'm sure you will appreciate that as a CISO.
Yes. And I have my auditing certification too.
Oh, great.
I do. Yeah.
So dovetailing off of what Jim was saying, I think the tone at the top is important. I mean, back in the 90s when I graduated, security was viewed as an afterthought, a bolt-on cost. That guy down the hall did that. Nowadays, it's because everything's done electronically. I think it's ingrained, and I think the board and the C-suite, they too are engaged, and it filters down from there. I think the entire staff has to be aware. And that can come in the form of, phishing exercises, and intrusion detection and whatnot.
Thank you. John?
Thanks, Sherry. And it's great to be here with everybody. I appreciate you putting this together. Look, following on from Jim and Mark, they're exactly right. I mean, I think Jim set the stage at a broad level, and Mark, in enterprise is exactly right. It's the board is paying attention. The employee is now enlisted in security. That's a very big topic, in companies, and using phishing as a teaching exercise. One of the other things I do is I sit on an advisory council at American University for their business school focused on cybersecurity governance. We talk about things like insurance. We talk about the role of the board. When should escalation occur? What is the threshold for a CEO to be made aware of an issue inside of a company? How is that managed? Especially when you talk about a government, you talk about publicly traded companies. This is incredibly complex, and every industry, has sort of come at this, over the last, some earlier like defense, and, you can argue banking. In my world, media, it really got real in 2014 with the Sony breach. But prior to that, piracy, pirate radio, we all think about, XPL, and, that was a legitimate thing, but when you think about that was a big issue, and it still is an issue, piracy of linear television around the world, or stream stealing, and especially in sports, which I've spent, a lot of time around, kind of thinking about how you secure, large scale events. That's hard. And industry, I think, is addressing it on one hand, but continuing to struggle on the other. And it's a very relevant topic for people from a career perspective on where this is going. And to your point on women, Sherry, my CISO at Discovery is a woman. I hired her. She was fantastic. Trish Collins-Whedon, one of the best CISOs in media in the country, if not in the world.
There's at least 3 of us out there somewhere.
Right. She's seriously brilliant. It would be fun for you to meet her. So anyway, but
I am kidding about that, but it isn't necessarily a place most women migrate
to. Completely. Anyway, I think those guys are right, and it's definitely, a personal issue, a corporate issue, and industry, I think, is focused, but the response is interesting, in some industries, where regulated industries are different than an industry like media that's completely sort of unregulated. So anyway. Yeah.
Jim and Mark, just because John brought it up, can you explain to the audience the thing that happened in security that might have raised your awareness, like he's talking about, as a media guy, what affected him in 2014? Do you have a brief snippet there of what caught your attention about security? Or an event that was important to either one of you? Yeah,
for me, I'm on the vendor side, right? So I'm not on the implementation side. So for me, it was all about, I'm a serial entrepreneur with a lot of entrepreneurial instincts. And it was back in the early 90s, it was an emerging area where you could make a mark as a company and as an individual from a career perspective. And there were very few threats compared to today, and very few technologies. There were only 3 or 4 companies at the time doing this. This is before Symantec, right? So these were companies like IBM that obviously was securing their mainframes, right? It was companies like Security Dynamics, RSA, which looked at the authentication problem for people, believe it or not, that were climbing up telephone poles and doing telephone repair maintenance. Well, what they were doing is they were getting into these telephone switches, and then they were selling access to those switches, because each of those switches had a specific telephone number that you could dial in. So you could stand on the corner in New York City at a phone booth and pay somebody $10 and then go talk to your relatives somewhere around the world. And so in essence, it was like John was saying, right? So they were siphoning off services and deferring revenue that these companies were in essence due to. But for me, it was really all about, how do you make your mark, and how do you create an interesting opportunity and a solution, and a chance to build a great company. So as an example, with Security Dynamics RSA, you know, we built a great company that in 1994 we took public and drove up to a $2.5 billion valuation before the whole internet boom, which, you know, was one of the top successful IPOs of top 10 IPOs of 1994. And, you know, we all got our pictures in Fortune magazine, which was pretty exciting. But for me, it was really an entrepreneurial chance to build a company, and it just happened to be around this emerging area, right? So as I look at it, there's many ways that you can look at this business. You can look at this business as a user of these products, or solutions. You can look at this business as a chance to create these solutions and be on the vendor side, or, you know, if you really have entrepreneurial instincts, to go off and start a company and or get involved from a you know, a finance standpoint or an M&A standpoint. So there's lots of ways you can wrap your arms around this type of business and have great opportunity if, you know, if you're looking at it from a career perspective. But for me, you know, it was really all about an entrepreneurial opportunity.
How about you, Mark? Was there anything that anecdotally sparked your interest in security?
It was just really on-the-job training, because when I started as an auditor, like as I said, I was a system administrator for years before I became an auditor, and that's like a step up, because now you're assessing the work that you did. So some of the things that I learned that opened my eyes were, in addition to cyber, we want these systems to be available. So we looked at things like software development, operating system hardening, because I think out of the box, the operating system comes wide open. So we want to go in and turn off services that aren't necessary. Some incidents that caught my eye. I mean, there was the flash crash of 2010, because these stock markets, the different companies, they're all interconnected now. On the plus side, that means there's redundancy, but on the negative side, if one is impacted, it can affect the others.
Thank you. For me, it was in 2002, I think, when the I Love You virus came out. Oh, that got me. I was the only one handling the antivirus software here at Fitchburg State, so that one came as a shock. We'll leave it at that. So John, without saying the word Google, what resources do you recommend for keeping updated on new and emerging information technology or information security vulnerabilities and solutions? So you can't say Google it.
Well, no.
Well, you can. It's all right.
I think that, you know, resources, I think about a strategy, right? What are you trying to protect, right? What is your strategy for your own security? Once you determine that, then you go and find the resources, right? Do you want to use a password manager? And what is the best password manager out there? Do you want two-factor authentication to be a thing? Are you comfortable using your thumb, or do you want it to be face, right? There's so many things that you get presented with on a daily basis, just in a, you know, from a consumption perspective, that have security implications and password implications for you. So I think once you find those areas where you're interested or you're concerned, you know, I lived in England for a while, so we still have a UK bank account, and HSBC uses these little digital fobs that, you know, I have to renew like every 18 months or so because the battery dies or they change them out or whatever. And that's fine. I think that's an acceptable security thing for me to have to go through that process. So I'm comfortable doing that, and I'll find the best resource. We don't, you know, not to go too far into my own personal, but, you know, password managers are interesting. Do you want to use a Dashlane or one of the large scale password protectors and authenticators? You know, that choice is a big choice, right? Suddenly you have one master password. You know, as a consumer, is that interesting to you, and or do you want to do that? Once you determine sort of your stance, I think then you can research. And am I going to say Google? Sure, I'm going to say. But I'm also going to say, you know, there's a lot of businesses out there, a lot of small businesses that do this, you know, as kind of community things that are super helpful, and people that are, you know, really, really smart. that can be helpful, to people. To your point on the older community, my mother-in-law just had a phishing or a phone call, and half fell for it. I mean, it happens all. She's a smart woman. She's only 70 years old. She's not a person who has difficulty navigating the internet, but she fell for a little phishing scam. So it happens every day. So we have to be careful, and I think that you have to pick your places that you want to try to protect, and then strategize beyond that.
Thank you. Mark, where do you go for your resources in keeping up with vulnerabilities and solutions?
Well, I think for industries and companies, there's information sharing committees. I think the abbreviation is ISAC, ISAC, and they're prepended by industry. I think there's FS-ISAC for financial sector, and there are for critical infrastructure and whatnot. And that would be for industry. I think on a consumer level, most of us probably subscribe to some sort of antivirus, be it Norton or McAfee. I think they have subscriptions that you can choose to get emails from them, and that's another good source. And I'm an advocate of antivirus.
Yeah, me too. Jim.
Well, again, it's for me, being on the vendor side, I kind of flip it over 180 degrees for your question. So for me, it's really about, what are the emerging sectors and where do we want to focus, right? So what are the problems, not of today, of tomorrow? And, what are those technology areas, whether it's, zero trust as an interesting area, or automated or continuous scanning and vulnerability assessment. These are hot areas, or cloud, of course, is just a massive hot area for putting products in place, as well as regulation in GDPR, right? So the whole area of regulation and compliance is a very complex area that frankly large enterprises will spend millions of dollars on for solutions, right? So for me, it's all about looking at where are the holes, where are the holes that need to be filled, and what's emerging, and what are the interesting technologies and approaches that are going to win in these areas. And then it's identifying a pain point, talking with people like Mark and John about the people that have to implement these, and really understanding their pain point. And then it's a race to the finish. It's a race to be first. It's a race to get your product out there, to show value, to have, to raise the flag so that you are the vendor for choice in carving out an opportunity where you can be the #1 vendor really approaching that problem. And if you do a good job of that, then you've got venture guys chasing after you, and 2 to 5 years from that, all of a sudden people are knocking on the door, buying your company. And so I'm happy to say I've had the luxury of going through that multiple times. And we threw the dart at the dartboard a number of times, more than a handful of times. And we hit a couple of bullseyes, and we hit a couple of singles, and then we struck out a few times and spent a lot of money striking out. But they're not all winners, right? And when you strike out, you just go right back to the well, and went with the approach that worked previously. And that's for me, that's created a good approach to really understanding where and how to stay relevant in this business, especially as a guy who's an old timer in the software business.
So do you think for a second we could guide that toward how an individual would keep up to date on current vulnerabilities, as an example? So have any of you regularly subscribed to or even researched a resource that people can use to actually discover what's current in the vulnerability spectrum and what possibly they can do about it? I'll let anybody chime in there.
Mark, is that an area that you have a little expertise in?
Well, I'm more in auditing companies, but as far as individuals are concerned, I think we've touched on it in the conversation that antivirus, if you subscribe, then you have the option of getting onto an email list. And I'm thinking as I'm hearing John and Jim talk that, my experience with security over the past 20 or 30 years has been, at first it was an inconvenience. It's something that people had to do an extra step just to get in.
Right.
Where we'd like industry to go is for security and operations to work together. I think an analogy could be, if you're coming from the North Shore into Boston, 93 is probably your best route. But if you have to go through multiple tolls and there's always accidents, you might go all the way around 128 just to avoid that. That could be an analogy of security. We'd like to clear up 93 and make it not only safe, but fast. And if we could bridge the two, that would be the ultimate goal.
Thank you. Okay. I like to, when I am here at Fitchburg State, I often am the security training person too. I have one other person that works with me, and we kind of juggle it back and forth. But I'm always appealing to my colleagues at Fitchburg State to treat security as they would treat their own information from home. So if we're working here at Fitchburg State and maybe having to collect a social security number, I always tell everybody, ask yourself, would I give this information out if someone was asking me? And that is how I kind of relate the idea of information security to the individuals who I work with, and am bound to have to train yearly. So our next question, and I think we'll start with Mark, is what does information security mean for the individual? And can you give us some insights based on your experience in the business world?
Well, if I may, I'll start back with the individual again. John mentioned two-factor authentication earlier. I fully advocate that. That's something and something you own. Like something could be a password, and something you own could be your cell phone that would receive a temporary code. There are methodologies out there for convenience, like Facebook and Google offer to save your passwords, and your own computer might offer to save your password. My opinion of that is I wouldn't recommend it. I mean, if it's something casual, maybe, but I certainly wouldn't recommend it for something like a bank account. I think it's just freely offering your trust to third parties. So I wouldn't recommend that to individuals. That's just my opinion. That's the way I feel.
John.
Look, I think I'll go back to what I said before. I think that, as a consumer, there are so many interactions you have with security on a daily basis. All the things that, Mark mentioned, not storing passwords, not, keeping up to date on your either virus protection or even your just simple operating system. But I think wider in industry, the last probably, in my view, 3, 4, 5 years, at least in the media business, it's gotten really serious. These are assets that are valuable. When you're talking about, a box office that's worth tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars, right? For that asset to be stolen is not great, obviously. But it's interesting when it got serious and why it got serious. I mentioned the Sony breach, and I mentioned, kind of around that. But when CEOs start seeing their names in the paper and the things that they said in a text or in an email, it gets really serious inside of a company. And they don't need the public embarrassment. The stock doesn't need the negativity, and on. And I was lucky to work for a CEO at Discovery, David Zaslav, who was great at this. He would say all the time, email is the company's tool. It's not a personal tool. Not what you come to do is hang out and send emails to your friends. You come to use a company tool. And David's name never showed up. He never, did any of that stuff that some of the other media CEOs were, put out there for, which was unfortunate, but they did it. But it really got serious. And I think that when people see their names and it gets to the point of personal, when you're the one who's breached, when you're the one who has your personal stuff put out there, that makes it real. And the media industry, I think, has gone through that the last 4 or 5 years, and that's obviously made it quite real. And there's been material and significant investments. not just because of that, but certainly there was an understanding of what cybersecurity means when your name is in the Journal or in the Times, or
Yeah.
worse, TMZ, or worse. You know?
I totally agree with you. And even from the standpoint of the reputation of the institution or the company or whatever that you are associated with, it can be wild.
Your personal brand, the company's brand, the governance of the business's brand, all of that. I mean, it's bad. If you're the CISO at the university who leaked, somebody hacked into your grading system. Oh my God.
Yep. Yes.
Well,
it
John,
really does become real when your name's on that position. Absolutely.
John, just following up on that, I think you make a great point, right? And part of the point is there's a very wide continuum of where different companies and or individuals in those companies fall on the continuum with regards to the level of impact and or seriousness they give to this problem, right? And I think your example of the Discovery CEO was a great one. When CEOs or people at high level or boards realize the value of these assets and the tools of the company are tools of the company and not individuals, and they put plans in place, it starts from the top down. Right? There's lots of CEOs and boards, frankly, that are distracted on lots of other either operational issues or, frankly, personal issues. You see the CEO of Twitter today, and I'm reading in the Wall Street Journal about how he has 3 or 4 people that basically run the day-to-day operations because he's very distracted on his personal issues. And that's all fine and good, I suppose. But if you're the board of that company, and there's associated risk of either what gets done or what does not get done, and all of a sudden you're all over the evening news or you're on the editorial section of the Wall Street Journal, and the next thing you know, your market cap has dropped $1 billion, right? It's impactful in many different ways, and so there's a vast continuum, and unfortunately at the bottom end of that continuum, where there's a lot of risk, is in small business, because for many small and medium-sized businesses, they're so focused on running the business just to try to stay alive, just to try to keep the operation going, just to have money come in the door so they can pay employees. They get distracted on other things, and this becomes an afterthought. And unfortunately, sometimes those companies or individuals get stung, whether it's through ransomware or other problem areas, and the economics associated with that can be quite impactful.
Big companies, I could tell you stories of finance departments writing hundreds of thousands of dollar checks on spoof emails from CEO name. Ex-CEO at whatever sends email to some director level person in finance saying, "Hey, John, I just did this deal. Can you please cut a check for somewhere below the threshold of the goal?" If there's a $250,000 sign off at a director level, the check's for like $240,000. So they found out what the cutoff is. Then they send the email. Then the person in finance goes, "Oh, I want to please the CEO." So he cuts a $240,000 check to company X, and suddenly the money's gone. You're exactly right. It happens all the time.
Yeah, bringing that down to the individual level too. I've known people, even here at Fitchburg State, who have been compromised by their social security number being discovered off of some leak or some breach somewhere, and who have dealt with years of issues trying to get bad credit ratings taken away or straighten out loan applications, or being discredited for their financial situation. It's just awful.
That's the other thing. Credit monitoring service, 100%. Should definitely have credit monitoring service.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Okay, offensive versus defensive security. So let's have some examples, if you don't mind, of the proactive kinds of things you've done to handle an exploit or handle a situation that's come up in security, and conversely, the reactive things that have to happen and what the difference is. So for this case, I'd like to start with Jim.
Well, again, being on the vendor side, I have a different perspective on the problem. We have clients now that, let's just say, are very proactive offensively when it comes to cybersecurity. So we have certain, let's just call them government clients that they're in the business of creating identities for people that operate outside of this country. And they have to create these identities in a way so that when they put an individual into a hotspot, let's say, that individual's got a full identity so that when that individual's trying to get things done in that environment, people who might question that individual, can look at a history, can look at a profile, can look at bank accounts, can get as much information as they want. And this information and this individual is quite real. It's almost kind of like that sequence in the movie Men in Black, where somebody just all records of this individual disappear. Well, it's the exact opposite. All records just appear, and this person is created out of thin air, and then they go in and they do their work, and then that person in their profile just completely disappears. So you have activities around cybersecurity which can be created to accomplish certain goals, whether it's in the intelligence community or any let's say state actor oriented scenario. And then obviously the industry and the way we talk, we think and we act and we procure mostly defensively, but there's a number of offensive activities that go on a regular basis. Mostly within country, they're done by sometimes mostly unscrupulous individuals, right, who are trying to gain something. But there's a lot of work that gets done both in private industry and through our government on the offensive side, whether it's understanding and analyzing the code or trying to gain information that's going to help in a national security way that is not typically discussed in the press and is not typically discussed in industry or at the user level, but there are real needs for some of these activities and that go on, and you can have a personal opinion about that, of course, as many people do, and you can have a privacy opinion about that, as many people do, but these are real activities that go on a regular basis, and the technologies that we have and the products that are out there, whether they're cybersecurity or other related information technology tools, they're used in this way on a daily basis.
I kind of feel like, at least in my career in information security, all of it begins reactively. Something happens. Like I was talking about the I love you virus, and you were all talking about various other things that brought your attention to the need for solid security plans. And I think the reaction that we had in holy cow, we need to do something, started the process to become proactive. So you begin to look at things and say, okay, this happened. I'm going to react to this and solve it. But now I have to go forward and try to prevent this from happening in the future, which then kind of activated, at least in the education field where I've been, kind of activated boards of trustees and presidents and other information technology folks to say, we need to plan, we need to put some money toward protecting our data. And now we have a mix. We always will have the reactive because something new is always happening, but we are also building and building and building upon our proactive solutions. And I think that's been an important way it's all grown.
Geary, I'd like to summarize that, because I tell my people this all the time. Things happen for two reasons in cybersecurity. either an incident has occurred, which is your point about reaction,
Mhm.
right? Or there's a regulatory requirement. The auditors have come in and they found a hole, and we have to have a solution in place by December 1st, right? Those are the two main drivers in this business. And unfortunately, the implications of incidents occurring can be pretty dramatic, as John, Mark, and yourself you've highlighted.
Mark, how about you? Do you have an example of an exploit that you've handled either proactively or reactively that you'd like to share?
Well, I mean, I'd like to touch on something that could be simple, not necessarily easy, but simple, and that would be like factory settings. On the consumer level, we probably all have a router in our homes for our internet and our television. They come with factory passwords. Take the extra step to change that password. Otherwise, you're probably giving your neighbors free Wi-Fi. If you get a new cell phone.
That's an awesome example, Mike. That is great. Keep going. I just want to point out that's a great example. Proactive.
When you get a new cell phone, take the extra step to set up a PIN screensaver. Otherwise, when you leave it on the bus, the person who picks it up is going to have access to all your credentials. And that could apply to companies as well. I mean, a factory router, say they buy a camera with a microphone for their boardroom. If they just set it up and they don't bother to change the factory password, well, that's going to make it awfully easy for somebody to, we mentioned Google earlier, Google that device part number, and voila, there's your password. You're in. Now you're eavesdropping on the boardroom. You've got the crown jewels. So those are some examples. It's just, it's just taking that extra step to customize things, and don't leave factory defaults.
So let me just take that one step further. My company just released a product based on that market opportunity, Mark, that you just suggested. So here's a great example. So all the disk drives from a company like Seagate and Micron, all these self-encrypting drives, which every organization is now buying, so it automatically encrypts the data as it stores it. And data at rest is a massive problem, right? So you look at the Facebook exploit or the Marriott exploit that intruders came in and stole 60 million records of data at rest, right? So all these self-encrypting disks have vendor-supplied static passwords, just as you suggested, Mark. And guess what doesn't happen? Everybody who buys those disks doesn't go and change the password. And not only that, the companies provide utilities where I can ping the disk and find the password.
In plain text.
In plain text, right? So now you just spent $2 billion developing a new drug, and you have all that information on a self-encrypting disk, but the door's wide open to get into the house. So if I can get into your network, then I can gain access to all that data. So as an example, we just came out with a brand new product that allows organizations to manage those passwords specifically for self-encrypting drives, SEDs, and FIPS 140-2, which is just a variant of these self-encrypting drives, right? So these are simple problems which we've talked about for 30 years. And there's products and organizations and companies which still fall into the trap of leaving those doors open. And so, there's Facebook. Facebook is a very secure and security-oriented company. I have a patent in key management, and my patent, believe it or not, has many, many references, and the most references it's received is from Facebook. And you sit there and say, well, they're a social media platform. They're doing amazing work in cybersecurity, right? And so when a company like Facebook gets hacked for 30 million users, right? There are some pretty sophisticated problems and simple problems that get unfortunately wrapped up in the level of sophistication of their networks or their environments that intruders can come in and of course, really cause havoc.
John?
Well, interestingly, the vast majority, I think, Jim, you're right, but the data, the vast majority of breaches come through password compromise, social engineering. Somebody calls up, an executive assistant and some position in an organization or a coordinator level, they target, it's really interesting to watch where intrusions come from. It's very strategic. But 9 times out of 10 or 8 times out of 10, it's not very technically savvy. Bold, straight out intrusion is not successful, right? We've all spent, I think, enough money and time building enough moat around the business where we can really see what's happening. I think what we can't see, at least in my industry, is how much data is leaving the business, right? We send around massive files in the media industry. Think about a 4K movie, it's terabytes, with HDR and all the accoutrements wrapped around it. That's a massive, massive file. And we expose that level of asset every day in the media industry. So, seeing some little leak of financial information coming out that's a little bursty and it might be a couple of gigs of data, that really doesn't bother us because we could see 50, 80, 100 gigs flying out of the business and it's like, okay, fine. So, I think a lot of companies have done a great job building big moats around their business. But what this comes down to, and both I think you guys touched on it, is discipline, right? Discipline of an organization, discipline of leadership, discipline of the individual. My offensive and defensive examples are, look, when we built the cyber program at Discovery, we implemented all the tools. We phished our own employees. I phished our head of HR and she was not happy. We sent a very specific HR focused phish. Right, a person who would look to be extremely qualified for a role, it was borderline, I will say, on being sort of unfair of a phish, but they clicked on it and they learned some very specific things about how you can identify a phish. But the head of HR called me and she was not happy that I targeted her organization. And I said, look, this is what we have to do to remain vigilant in this business. So it comes down to discipline and implementing of tools and implementing of, good internal communication policies. Good reminders of what to do. It's not easy in a company. We were 15,000. It's not easy to communicate to 15,000 people in 50 offices around the world in multiple languages, but you have to do it. That's the only way. And then you have to, and Mark can talk to this, you have to ride the regulatory thing. GDPR was like, for anybody who's trying to implement a security program, GDPR is like the greatest thing that could have ever happened, so to speak, because it gave you a big hammer to go in and implement controls around a business. So, use regulatory for what it's worth.
Okay, before we get to the questions, we're all going to take just a moment to let you know our feelings, at least, about a career path into information security. And I'm going to start because I've already given you a hint that it's not exactly a huge attraction to women in information technology to get into security. And I'll tell you, when it first came to my attention that I was going to be given this position when I was 10 years ago, after having been a help desk manager and then a system administrator and then a project planner, I found myself with enough experience in a variety of things to be able to kind of roll into information security, but I was scared to death of it. I thought this is going to either be the most boring thing I've ever done in my life, or it's going to be the hardest thing I've ever done in my life. And quite honestly, it turned out to be neither. It's not at all boring. It's very interesting to see, especially I would recommend looking into the discovery of how breaches and malware is developed, or breaches happen, and the things that you have to investigate in order to come to a conclusion about how you might resolve a problem has been an incredibly exciting thing to do. And it has kept me fascinated now for 10 or 11 years in this part of the field that I didn't think I was going to be very good at. But the one thing I will say that has helped me is my knowledge of the institution, my knowledge of the people in the institution, and my ability to communicate. And I think John was just talking about communication being key, and it is key. It is absolutely key to a good information security plan. It's communicating, it's staying on top of situations, it's explaining, it's being persistent, and it's a really great career. It's a really great career for women. So
I think your path, by the way, Sherry, is in my corporate experience for women, is a pretty common path. Program management, look, all of this is program management. At the end, you're implementing a strategy, right? Someone has devised the strategy. You've gained enough experience in implementing enough programs to actually just to be able to know the answer, right? So you've used all that and say, this is the strategy we should implement. And I think I see that a lot. I've had some very talented female executives, senior vice president and executive vice president, and senior level people who grew up through that program management, sort of organization of people, organization of information, and coordination and tracking. It's a really valuable skill that, look, the consultancies teach it and they work you to death to do it, but there's a lot of skill in that mindset. And I see a lot of women who know how to do that. So good for you.
thank you. Jim, do you want to give us your...
Sure. Listen, I think there's great opportunities on the vendor side. The good news for people coming out of the school and or in the local area is Boston, in the Boston area, still remains a hotbed for cybersecurity companies. And these cybersecurity companies are welcoming to everyone, whether you're male or female, doesn't matter what color or ethnicity you are, because everybody wants people who can positively contribute to the mission, right? Which is the mission around the product and growing the business. And I'm happy to say that, I've had the chance to work with a number of great people in this area who are just remarkable, well-educated, and exciting people to work with. And again, you can take your path in many different areas. If you want to dig in on the technical side and dive in deep on extremely low-level problems, you can do that. If you want to come in on the marketing and sales side and be in an area where you have the potential to really create an identity for yourself as well as the company, and potentially to really cash in, right? Some of these opportunities can be very lucrative, and I've had the pure luck of working hard and being in the right place at the right time, and luckily we've been able to emerge with some of these opportunities and do well economically. But those situations all exist. And it doesn't matter if you're coming from Fitchburg State or anywhere else, right? If you're willing to be focused and to make the commitment and work hard, you can rise to the top. I never thought I'd be in the software business. I never thought I'd be a software CEO of multiple companies. And, over the course of my career, I personally have raised over $250 million for the companies that I've built. And, I've had the Rockefeller family invest in 5 of my companies, and it's been quite an exciting journey. And it all started, frankly, believe it or not, at Fitchburg State, and as a student and a member of the illustrious Mohawk Club.
Oh boy, Mark.
Sure. I've been keeping an eye on the participant count, and it's remained stagnant. So. That said, if you've joined this call tonight, you've shown interest, and this industry is on fire. It's just a sea of opportunity. And, with that, it's impossible to know it all. So you have to specialize. You have to pick something you're interested in. I mean, I've been away from the university for 20 years now, and even then, the computer lab was stellar. So, I'd imagine it has only gotten better over time. My opinion of one of the factors of this explosion is, again, back to the 90s, we had IP version 4, which was, a finite number of IP addresses, and most businesses had a need to be online. But then somewhere around the turn of the century, we've implemented IP version 6 to where there's more IP addresses than there are grains of sand in the entire world. So everything's online now. Traffic lights, your cars, your toaster, your refrigerator, your watch, everything is online. That said, we've just become fully connected. So again, this industry is just on fire. There's a lot of opportunity. So yeah, I'm excited for everybody on the call.
Sherry, I'll add one more thing if I could.
Sure, go for it.
Career path. We talked about women before, but the other side too is, look, this is a heavily, on the technical side, this is a heavily certification-driven industry. So, you know, get your cloud certification, get your AWS or Google Cloud architecture certification. You know, there's a path, right? And I'm not an expert in this in terms of what the path should be, but look, the resources are available. I know that in my experience in spending time at Google, there are thousands of resources out there to get the certification, to get the, you know, clarity on how things work that are going to just make you more marketable. And that's, you know, almost like an investment in yourself. And something interesting for the university to think about is how the university can sponsor or drive certifications as part of a curriculum too, as an add-on to that, or some recommended certification track that students go on. Maybe that's a program series of
That's second that. It's really important.
In the campus, you know, how could you implement an educational thing that's a recommended certification path for computer science majors or people interested in these kinds of fields? I mean, it's an interesting document, at least, to build, you know?
It sure is, and you're somewhat answering a question that's been posted on the chat that we'll get to in a second. But I'm going to read up a couple of the questions that have come up here. So why don't you, if you feel like you're probably the most knowledgeable to answer this question, we'll have one person answer the question instead of trying to do it all together, unless somebody has something to add in. But Viera Laurenkova asked, can you please provide other tips and suggestions on how to protect personal data on iPhones and other portable devices? Does anybody want to handle that? Just give me a little nod. If not, are you giving me the eye?
I'll just say that iCloud and Google Drive are, look, they're certainly secure, right? Again, they're as secure as your front end password is. They're as secure as the amount of times you repeat. You know, look, are they going to see suspicious activity? Sure. Do they need to see it at volume to see it, you know, to detect something? Look, I think in general, to Jim's point, you know, all of these companies, they get a lot of, you know, whatever, I'll say it's shit for it, right? Security. But these guys are spending a lot of money and they're trying really hard. Are they great? And I'm not sitting here being an apologist for any of them, because I think they can do better and they should spend more of the billions in profits that they make. But, you know, is there a massive effort going on in these companies? Yes. So to the answer on iCloud and Google Drive, sure, they're definitely safe. But again, as safe as you are, because a mass breach is obviously quite rare, but we'll have one tomorrow just because I said that, and you can all come back, whatever. Yes.
And just as a side note, Vera, I know here we have not enforced the two-factor authentication on Google or on Gmail. We have it optional, but not enforced. And that's an excellent way to make sure that no one else is getting into your personal information. So,
is it a pain or is it better? Oh yeah.
Yeah.
No doubt.
So that is one way. And the other option is, you know, keep your phone on passcode so it does not get into someone else's hand and be able to be opened up immediately. So when that passcode comes back up, or facial recognition, if it doesn't recognize the face or it doesn't know the passcode, then, you know, that's probably one of the best things you can keep active on your phone. Jasmine, I cannot confirm or deny that I fish you people here at Fitchburg State, and but thank you for your endorsement. Jasmine mentions that she appreciates that I occasionally fish its campus. How could I possibly do that? Jeffrey, I think John kind of partially answered your question, what can an educational institution do to prepare the next generation against ethical hackers or get prepared ethical hackers?
Yeah.
And I totally agree with what John said about certifications. I think it's a hugely important thing. We're just now here getting started with information security as part of the information technology major. And I think we're making great strides, but I've often said that I thought those certifications would be an awesome thing to provide here at campus, because if students could leave with not only the education but the certification, I think they'd be miles ahead of their peers in other schools. But Jim, I thought this would be a good one for you to say something about too.
Okay. Go ahead. Well, I'll just say quickly, one of the other things we did talk about ethical hackers that was an offensive to your last question was active penetration testing. So, basically you pay a company, and this is sort of like ethical hacking, right? You pay a company to come in and this company's on retainer. We paid them hundreds of thousands of dollars a year to do it. And they would retain a staff of people that would come in and basically try to hack us. And we knew that that was happening during this period of time, and it was all, there. We wanted to expose vulnerabilities. So you can think about ethical hacking in a way of trying to do good, or you can think about ethical hacking as a career. And that's what companies like FireEye and others provide as services to do that. So it's a super interesting field. But yes, certifications are key to being able to know how to do it.
Anybody else want to chime in on this?
Yeah, I agree with everything John had said. I think certifications are key, and then it's part of it is, if you want to direct your experience there, it's taking a holistic view, right, of where the threats are in an organization and how you get to them, and usually that's not something you can do in your first couple of years out of school, but with 5 or 10 years experience and a commitment to really learning and understanding cybersecurity, you can be a very powerful resource, and that's a great opportunity if that's where people want to take the direction of their careers, and that will be a gift that keeps on giving for a long time. The need for penetration testers or ethical hackers is not going away. It's getting intensified. We get requests weekly from big Fortune 500 companies, looking at very specific problems of new products that they're putting out, and because they only have limited security resources. One of our director of security in our company, believe it or not, was actually the guy that found the Russians penetrating the F-35 program and uncovered that whole problem area. So we have resources like that, and there are people like that who are just incredibly talented in understanding where the vulnerabilities and problems are. And every big company needs that, whether it's for their own infrastructure or their product sets, if you're in the business.
Mark, when I have right here my little CISA pin, my Certified Information Security Auditor pin that I got as my first certification in information security. And I'm wondering, have you found that in education, the subject of information security auditing is really, it's non-existent. I mean, it's a whole different way of thinking about security and information technology. And I know I struggled with the classes when I took them, because my instinct was always deny, protect, right? And the auditor is actually looking for plan, policy, follow the policy, et cetera. So have you seen anything emerging in education that kind of addresses that side of the house?
Sherry, I would agree with you that auditing is kind of a niche environment. I mean, in my case, at the Securities Exchange Commission, my role expects experience in auditing, finance, legal, and technology, and that's a tough four-legged stool.
Yeah. Yes.
But if I may shift gears a little bit, I think there's a huge opportunity in risk management. Yeah. And I would assume that applies to the greater Boston area. We haven't brought up impact analysis in this conversation. I mean, like, if I could just generalize and guess at what might be important at the school, things like payroll databases and student records, things like that. Do an impact analysis. What are the keys to the kingdom? What is most valuable and what would be most detrimental if breached? And then start protecting accordingly. So that said, I think there's a huge area in risk.
I agree. Yep, I agree with you. Emily, you asked Jim. You said you never thought you'd be in the software business. Can you tell everybody what brought you from education to software and cybersecurity?
We're turning the Wayback Machine on here. You know, when I went to Fitchburg State, you either went for industrial arts education or you went for nursing. And I think that was about 80% of the majors, right? So there was, as an example, there was no computer science major back then. There wasn't a business major back then, right? The school was very focused in two major areas. But I'll tell you, I had a handful of just outstanding professors that pushed me to explore different areas, and I had a team of people that I spent a lot of time with, you know, in the Mohawk Club that really pushed each other to excel in different areas. And you know, we had a lot of people who were industrial arts education majors that, you know, some of us went into business. Others, like Paul White, as an example, who's on the call, became a state policeman and had a tremendous career with the Mass State Police. And you know, we were able to learn and gain instincts and really be put in touch with the opportunities that allowed us to really flower our careers. And for me, that led for, you know, a full scholarship for graduate school, and then I went on after that and got my MBA after that. But it was a great opportunity, and with just a tremendous amount of encouragement by the professors at the school, and it really allowed, you know, myself and my peers to blossom in a number of different ways, which maybe we just didn't expect.
Does anybody want to unmute and ask a question? I just actually lost my video, so Emily, I'm relying on you to call on somebody because I gotta pull it back here.
We could still see you.
I know. I can still hear everybody. I just can't get my video back on here. Go ahead. Is there anybody who's looking to ask a question?
Not that I can see.
Okay. Well then, do any of our panelists want to make a final closing remark?
Look, I'll just say that, look, I think this area is obviously hot, as we've talked about. There's tremendous opportunity. And the paths are, you know, probably 3 or 4 that you can consider. Consider the technical path, which certifications we talked about are key. I think the one phrase that hasn't come up tonight is healthcare, you know, as an industry. And I think you can look at, you know, various industries, banking, healthcare. Fitchburg is obviously known to the nursing point that Jim raised. You know, that's another industry. So you can sort of look at industry and think about how to approach. You can look at regulatory, you know, kind of where Mark comes from a little bit in terms of the controls that are being put in place every day, either over industry or for the good of, you know, society to be able to control this stuff. So it's not getting smaller. I mean, that's the thing about, and it touches inherently every industry there is in some way, shape, or form. So, you know, you really can consider a wealth of opportunity. You know, in my world in media, you know, we came at it in some ways as a necessity, you know, from various hacks and breaches, but that prepared us for a world of, you know, completely on-demand content. You know, Hulu and Disney Plus and, you know, Netflix and all these platforms are completely dependent upon being able to secure a stream and being able to watermark that stream. And there's, you know, industry experts who are just so smart around these capabilities that can and then work on, you know, very, very high profile events. I mean, you know, securing the Super Bowl as a stream is not a trivial task. And when you work with the people who do that, it's quite impressive. So, I think all of that is available to really anybody who wants to apply themselves, in this industry. It really just is about picking your path. Whether you want that path to be a technical path, whether you want it to be a marketing path, whether you want that to be a strategy path or industry implementing path of security is another way to think about it. Back to the healthcare thing, Boston is certainly rich in healthcare. And if you look at one industry that unfortunately struggles with data and not necessarily securing of data, but organizing and managing of data, it is the healthcare industry. And there are examples of hospitals who have spent millions on implementing patient records platforms that that's a really sad thing, but it's just an example of how this industry can play into that security data management.
Terrific. Well, listen, I want to thank my fellow panelists because I learned a lot tonight. John, I have very little experience in the media businesses, so it was fascinating to hear some of the challenges that you brought up, and in the prep calls that we've done and over the course of the evening. And Mark, dealing with auditors is in a sweet spot for me, right? Because they're always a good friend to product vendors, recommending different ways to get product into companies. And Sherry, it was fascinating to hear the trials and tribulations of what you've had to do to establish yourself there. And congratulations, really, in driving this forward for the school.
Thank you. And thank you, all of you, too. It's been a pleasure talking with all of you and getting to know you. And Emily, thank you so much for gathering us all together. And if there's no other questions, oh, wait, well, there is one. Paul, there's an opportunity for Fitchburg State College law enforcement students to cross-train with this area. Ah. So do you want to elaborate on that, Paul?
You're on mute.
Go ahead. You can please elaborate. That'd be interesting to hear.
Looks like you're still on mute, Paul. I know these buttons are so tiny, especially from the phone.
I think it's around, sort of, look, all of this, right? This thing has your life. And, police officer picks up a phone. Mark, you can talk to this world around theft of data. I mean, it's probably, I have to imagine the police spend a lot of time.
But I think it's an interesting concept, right? I think it's a very interesting idea because there could be a lot of, as they say, cross-pollination, where law enforcement and in different enforcement organizations are more and more coming across this requirement in their, from using tools and understanding, what tools that can be implemented, and so I actually think it's a great idea. And Paul, it looks like we've got you on now.
Go ahead, Paul.
Well, I'm not very computer literate. I still have a case of carbon paper in my house, so.
I do too.
But it's been my experience that, especially now, that there's a component to criminal investigations and civil investigations and personnel investigations. Always comes back to computers. It's such a integral part of people's lives that this is not going away. And to fall back on some of what your insight was, some of these things I always fell back on simple phrases, and blocks keep out honest people. Okay. And so all of these systems, it still falls back on the individual to use personal integrity if you will. And this was interesting. Like I said, my experience started in 1990 at the FBI Academy when we still had floppy disks and they were floppy. And but it was very interesting tonight. So thank you.
Thank you, Paul.
Well, that's very interesting.
By the way, I think that case of like things Paul's talking about, unlocking phones and what should technology companies be required or compelled to do in an investigation is going to be a very interesting topic over the next, with, you know, not to get into politics, but where the Supreme Court is and where is this going to go, and you know, is that private, and is somebody compelled to do that, and at what, you know, authority can require an entity to basically unlock your personal life? It's a really interesting debate.
And we're always looking for interdisciplinary connections across campus. It's, you know, one of our, I think, strengths, but also part of our strategic plan. So if they haven't thought of it already, you know, I'll definitely throw that idea out there, because I think that's a fascinating connection that's worth exploring.
Mm-hmm. And then Jasmine had one additional question that I'm sorry I missed, and that was if there is a programming language that has more issues with security over another. My personal opinion is, as we hear in the news quite often, Java has its issues, but do you guys have any other comments on that?
I would definitely say Java, but I'd also we always look at holes in between applications as the vulnerability point, regardless of language. So in APIs, in connectivity points between those were always great spots for penetration.
Jim?
I'm probably not the best person to comment on that, but I would just, you know, second what John mentioned with, you know, Java is well out there, and listen, any code base can be vulnerable if you don't, you know, implement it in a way that that uses the correct security approach, right?
Mm-hmm. Right. Or Mark, did you have anything you want to add?
Well, rather than bash an operating system, I'll advocate for my favorite is Linux. And in my opinion, unfortunately, whatever operating system it is, it seems to come off the shelf with everything turned on. I wish it was the other way around. I wish it came with everything turned off and you turn things on as you needed them. I think that would make things much more secure, but unfortunately that's not the way. So we have to go one step further and figure out what we don't need and turn it off. Otherwise we're leaving more doors open for people.
Very good.
Okay, anybody else want to chime in? Then Emily, I think I'll turn it back over to you. I want to thank everybody for being here this evening. It's been fun. It's nice to get a chance to do something a little different when I'm usually talking to my colleagues and not necessarily to the students and the alums. And so I'm happy to be here this evening, and I'm glad to have met those of you I haven't seen before. So thank you.
Thank you to all of our alumni panelists, and to Sherry for, you know, taking your time out of an already busy day in life. So thank you so much. We appreciate you guys being a part of our Falcon Talk tonight, and I wish you all the very best. Stay connected.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.
Have a great night.